need to sign your hold harmless agreement. We don't have one for this class.
Sticks and stones can break your bones, but English teachers will never hurt you. Something like that. Is my mic on? Olivia, are you there? I guess. What about that? Does that make a difference? Okay, I'm okay. Thank you. If you are new this time, you weren't here last time, the system from now on is that each of us spends 35 minutes on a story, and then we have with a 10-minute break in the middle. So that's the way we will proceed. And I drew, very happily, the Richard Bausch story, 1-900. And, you know, when I just liked the story, I thought it was funny, but as I got into it, reading it 2 and 3 times, I discovered that there's really an awful lot going on in there, and he has something worthwhile to say as well as amusing us. Not very amusing, actually, as you get into it. Just a word about Bausch. He's born in 1945. He's a Southern writer, born in Fort Benning, Georgia. 12 novels, 8 short stories, collections, and 1 volume of poetry. If any of you have the Richard Ford volumes that we used 3 and 4 years ago, that you like them so much, John, they just kind of fell apart for you. But anyway, there's 2. We used 2 different volumes, and there's a Bausch story in there, each one of them. If you want more Bausch, you can check those out without having to go to the library. Like so many of our writers, he's won lots of awards, has an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and is currently teaching, if the website is right, at Chapman University in Orange County, California, and is editor of the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction, at least until recently. Okay, you have noticed the quotes on the screen. Bert and I put a quote from Joyce Carol Oates on the syllabus. It's the first one up there. All forms of art are generated by the wish to make of the perishable something imperishable, and so forth. And just about any writer is going to have his version or her version of what is the core of writing, how you do a story. And Bausch has his. And in the process, I learned that Oates may have cribbed from Shakespeare, because the third quote there is, having cited the above passage, he says, "The eternal task of those who create is nothing more than this, to deal in human experience and try to be truthful to it in language." Well, nothing particularly shocking there, but truth to human experience. And I just like to read, because I think it's so beautiful, the Midsummer Night's Dream passage. "The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and name." So I don't know if Oates cribbed that or not, but I thought it was in the same ballpark as her quote. Most people have heard that passage from Shakespeare, even if they can't pull it up immediately. So, the task of the poet, the artist. At the beginning of in the anthology, in the preface, Oates mentions the Doctorow story, and most of the stories we're reading this time is being traditional stories, you know, character development, scene, all of that. Nice, fairly neat ending. And the Bausch is a little bit different. She calls it a virtuoso performance, something a little out of the mainstream. Although I think that he's doing many of the same things, accomplishes many of the same things as a traditional writer would accomplish. He just kind of angles into it in a funny way. And as Bert mentioned last time, it's always good to start at the beginning, at the first paragraph of a story to see what's going on. And I think this is particularly true of the Bausch, if you have it with you, on page 53. I'd like you to notice how much he accomplishes in terms of setting up that story and his themes. And so in the very first paragraph, if you are calling to talk to one of us hot girls, are using a touch-tone phone, and you have your credit card information handy, please press 1 now. We can hardly wait to talk to you. Well, there, you know, isn't that the core? It's a sex hotline, and it's, you know, perhaps one of the most intimate acts that can be conceived of, but it's reduced to a touch phone. You don't actually get to touch people. You use a touch phone, the media there. And this story, I believe, first appeared in 2003. What would Bausch do now with all the cell phones and so forth? You know, that you may have 1,000 friends or something on your chat pages, whatever. I don't use it, but do you really have any friends? You can get instead of going to a therapist or talking to your wife or husband or whatever, you reach out to a touch phone. So it's the irony there is turning to the touch phone for sex, I think, is quite apparent. And then the commercialization, the business deal, the credit card gets in there immediately, the making the money. And then this hot girls, I want to begin by talking about what happens to language and the language of personal relationships in this kind of age, of technology, of loneliness. I think I forgot to bring it, but oh, here it is. A few weeks back, there was this, in the Week, I think that's where I got it, yeah, an article, An Epidemic of Loneliness. In a survey of Americans, that we have fewer contacts, social contacts that are meaningful and so forth. It's really something new in the history of mankind. And it gives all kinds of statistics about percentages of people who have a friend or it says in about 1 in 11 Americans age 50 or older doesn't have a spouse, romantic partner, or a living child. And it goes on in that vein, but I think we're all familiar with the phenomenon. So anyway, that first paragraph tells us where we are, what we need to know, and then it goes on. The whole thing is in dialogue. Those of you that are taking Terry Lay's writing class know this week we talked about the importance of dialogue to pep up your writing, and of dialogue, of speech that actually sounds like speech, the give and take, without the padding, explanatory padding of who's saying this and who's saying that. And so that's, I guess you could say, the virtuoso performance. Okay, so I wanted to talk, beginning with touch-tone phone, talk about the language here and what has happened to intimate language, exact language. The language of intimacy, I believe, is John's word, but these aren't all quite parallel, but I'm just going to go through some of the contrasts I noticed. Of course, in contrast to hot girl, you might have a real woman, girl, a real person, but it's this manufactured concept that sex has to be involved or intimacy involves a hot girl, whatever that means. I also noted in that first paragraph, you have the pronoun problem. The caller is a generalized you, or it could be a personal you. but the person answering, one of the hot girls, is a corporate we or an imperial we. You know, again, that intimacy pushed away. And of course, her name is Marilyn. And and what he does with names here, I think, is very intriguing. And of course, the Marilyn Monroe, but it's a glitzy name. It's a Hollywood name. Turns out her name is Sharon, a perfectly lovely name, but it's an ordinary. Sharon is probably not going to show up in a porn movie or Some Like It Hot or How to Marry a Millionaire or whatever. And then his brother-in-law is Harv. Let me tell you about Harv here, he's a real person. And John, okay, John is his real name, but it's also what they call the guy who's buying sex, and we have John Doe. So in a way, the speaker is a very individual man, person, identity. We learn a lot about him. Yes, John.
I want to throw a stone in the water. We don't know if either of these people are being truthful anywhere through. We don't know if he's making up a line for her, especially she's making up a line for him.
Could be.
We can't identify if they're both leading each other on. We don't know anything about who they really are in spite of what they're saying.
Well, could be, but he does. There is a change in the story that indicates there's real people involved here, and she clearly is putting on an act. He says it's my real name. Maybe you're right, but he doesn't want sex. He has no trouble with sex. His sex life turns out to be pretty good. He needs intimacy, and John Doe, John, the caller for sex. He's kind of every man and yet this individual person who's calling. There's the tension that goes on through here that suggests to me that this is probably real people. He wants intimacy, something intimate. He wants to be intimate. And she replies, I don't really want to get personal, okay? He wants a real conversation. And of course, that's one of the problems with his marriage. He lives in his head. Convoluted mind, his wife says. She's tired of his convoluted mind. He can't stand her voice and her feminism. And he admits that he's deserving of her criticisms at times. But he wants something more. He wants something intimate. And Marilyn is just offering pornographic cliches. He is interested in, this is kind of funny, the search for knowledge and the cultivation of spirit. Who would call the sex hotline looking for that? But, this has nothing to do with Marilyn, but he notes that what he's getting in his life that's not part of him are people who want the American dream as fame. It's his nephew or a son or somebody wants. So, this tension here between what we need and what, in this case, the culture offers us. You want to be famous. Doesn't matter what you do, just so long as you get fame. And for me, this is, so many of our stories ultimately involve basic American issues. And I brought up in the Doctorow story that Earl says, what's important is getting ahead. Here, the American dream in that version. Here, it's fame. So it gets kind of funny going ahead with the contrast here. Funnier. John speaks that they have a good sex life and so forth, but a lethargy has settled on him. And what's her response? You couldn't get it up? You know, so that it all comes down, you know, this to the sexual energy or the lack of it, the language of our culture. He wants a friend, someone to talk to. And I think at one point she says, this is not part of our service. She provides a service, not a real friendship, but that's where he's turned. He wants someone to commiserate with, to have a natural conversation with. And all she can give him to a certain point is canned sex talk. And then they come to what I think is probably the turning point of the story. It's, I love you. He says, I love you, Sharon. You know, she's opening up a little bit, and they get into a discussion of, do you tell your clients I love you? And she says, yeah, if they want to hear it, it's harmless. But then what happens a few pages later? She's got, you know, he keeps querying her. Got a boyfriend, somebody? Yeah, he's pretty good to me, etc. But he won't say, I love you. Well, then we know what happens soon after this, doesn't it? Sharon gets a little uneasy, queasy. Let's see if I can go back into the text here. Maybe page 70. And Sharon has begun to open up. Oh, it's even before that on page 68. She said she's not the housewifey type, although she might, Kate's not the housewifey type, whatever that means, and Marilyn thinks maybe she wouldn't mind being a housewife someday. Okay, top of 65. He's talking about the men who call. Do they ever ask you to say you love them? Sure, some do. Now and then, one does. That's a pretty harmless thing to say. I love you. It's a pretty harmless thing to say. And you don't mind doing that? I'm talking on a telephone, lover. Any of them ever scare you? It's usually pretty friendly, like I say. I do most of the talking. There's one guy who calls to say what he'd like to do to me, an obscene phone caller, but we get it. But before we were around, he probably upset a lot of nice little housewives. And then we get into the housewife. And then if we go to 68, so that you notice he introduces the I love you being harmless, and then drops it for a while. And so you got to be paying, you know. Top of 68. Did you ever have a relationship fall apart? Maybe not a marriage. Actually, John, I've been in and out of relationships. I just haven't found the right one. I think the one I have now might be the right one. Only what? Nothing. No, you were going to tell me something. That was sweet. Come on, Sharon. Well, he never actually says the words, you know, that he loves me. I don't believe I'm telling you this. And it's important to you that he say it. Okay, yeah, right, it is. Wouldn't you wonder about it if you were seeing someone and you said, I love you to them all the time, and they never said it back? I love you, Sharon. Like that? Well, it would be him saying it. He's very nice, and I like being with him, but sometimes he seems to be avoiding it as a subject. And again, John says, I love you, Sharon. I love you. I really do. I feel the warmest sense of affection toward you now. Right now, it's the truest thing in my whole mistake of a life. And so forth. And then, a few more pages. '72. He suggested this, at the bottom of 71 that they get on with the conversation. You start, Sharon, when you're ready, talking the line, when it seems right to you. When it seems right to you. I started a couple of times, John, and you stopped me. The next time, I promise I won't stop you. But see, this is Sharon now. But see, I don't think it's going to seem right for me now. I mean, I don't feel it now. And I wouldn't be very convincing. I'm not feeling all that good now. To tell you the truth, I think I feel a migraine coming on. And of course, she could be just upset with him, but you know, it's that I think for me as I read this, it's that I love you. She started her thinking about her own relationship. And she tells him, you should have let me stay, Marilyn. I'm better as Marilyn. Okay, Marilyn, I love you, Marilyn. If I call the number again, can I ask for Marilyn? And will they put me through to you? They might. It's a strange world there, Marilyn. Only if you let yourself think about it too much. And then he asked this, this question of sex talk. I know it wasn't as good for you as it was for me. Okay. So, what has the conversation done for John? I mean, you know, we're usually in story, you want something to happen. Who has something happened to? What has happened to John? You know, there's rules of short storytelling that can be shed any number of times. One of them is show, don't tell. And that's what Bausch has tried to do here. It's all dialogue. There's no narrator interjecting opinions or anything. And another, you know, I used to tell students to see what the story's about, look to see who changes, who something happens to. But what happens to John in the course of the story? Does he have a change? We find out a lot about him. How did you feel? Yeah.
Well, he moves to a position where he is interacting with female.
Okay.
So he closes her out and ignoring her.
He's interacting, you say?
Interacting with a female, and then in return, he's trying to, instead of closing her out and forbidding her to speak.
Yeah. He's having a conversation. He has to force it. Do you think that there's any hope for his marriage? Have you read this, Joyce? Why not?
I don't think he has gotten any insight from this conversation. I think Sharon has had
Yeah. Yeah. Joyce is saying that he has interacted, but it's Sharon who changes. John is, although we learn quite a bit about him, I kind of like John. He's kind of a schmuck, you know, but he admits his weaknesses. Judy?
It seems like
Yeah,
the children away from him. It's her fault that the children are probably afraid of him.
yeah,
So he's just trying to justify his behavior and his thought.
but he does admit that he's maybe gone a little bit too far. I mean, doesn't, I mean,
Well, reluctantly, I mean, I don't think he sees that he has any responsibility or any part in the marriage falling apart.
yeah. Well, he does say at times, I mean, I don't, that she had a point or something like that, but yeah. So,
But there are people that live like that for years.
yeah,
They have actually there are four kinds of infidelities. There's philandering, a romantic accident, a business arrangement, and I forget the other one. But there are people, I'm a therapist, and there are people who live like this day in and day out, passing each other in the hall. And they kind of like to resign to it. And what'll happen, usually a catastrophic event will force them out of it.
yeah.
Something were to happen to his
She took the children and left. That's catastrophic. Yeah, yeah,
I like what Rosh is doing there with irony. I mean, we are on the way to a brave new world where we don't have sex for love and we take drugs to keep us dead to each other. I mean, we're halfway there, it's not perfect.
yeah,
And Bosch is really he's really helping us with the irony of all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, he's having intimacy, but in the worst possible way. I mean, maybe the phone conversation will actually apply to me, but we walk into a room, we don't even look at one another anymore.
yeah.
You go to a doctor's office or a tax office or whatever, and, we don't speak, and so how do we get started with one another if we don't speak?
And that's just, she can't stand his voice, or he can't stand her voice. She can't stand his convoluted mind. And Mike,
You get the feeling that she's not the first one he's ever called. That maybe he's doing this is his way of making a connection with a wife that he could never make a connection.
yeah, yeah,
And he's going to be doing this over and over. He's just trying to elicit responses to find out more or less, okay, there's something out there.
yeah. But I can't find Charlotte.
Well, I think there's tremendous irony in the very last sentences. Page 73 at the bottom. By John, and then he says, oh, that's the note you want, that's sexy as hell, the way you say that. She hangs up on him.
Okay, yes. If you're going to look at the beginning, you got to look at the end. He makes this phone call. Mike says maybe he's made lots of them. He needs to make contact with somebody. And what do you have at the end? Hello? Nobody there. So there's a lot of humor in here, beginning with the situation, but it's very sad. Yeah, yes.
I don't understand why she hung up. What difference does her, does it make what she says? She's still, I know she's changed, but for money, I mean, if she's doing the other for money, why can't she just have a conversation?
Well,
That's what I can't understand. I mean, if she were, and needed money rather than have to go to work with her children or
okay.
stay.
She's abandoned the practical side, but she's had some kind of awakening in the back.
But I think that she's uncomfortable with, she kind of wants the sex talk now, but it's gone beyond that point, and she can't do it. She's uncomfortable doing it.
Yeah.
So for her, she's done. The conversation's over.
Yeah. For whatever reason, she doesn't feel well. She's got a migraine. She's had.
It's like, I think it's gone beyond that.
Yeah.
It's taken her beyond that point where she can just go back to the old, routine that she does.
That she'll go back to the old routine?
No, that
She can't, yes, okay.
beyond that point.
Yeah. Ruth?
So not only she got a migraine, but on page 70, the point is, I don't feel right about this now. So she's starting this corporate, this way of commercializing sex talk or intimacy. Isn't right. It slides into a moral category.
Ruth is saying that before she says she has a migraine, she says, I don't feel right about this. That I guess the whole project is bothering her, what she's, yeah. Yes, Ralph.
I thought really the whole point was that 99 cents a minute was cheaper than a psychiatric.
Yeah, well, you do wonder why she didn't go to a priest or he didn't go to a priest or a psychologist or the guys at the bar. I don't know, you know. But if that's your only out, it's pretty sad, yes.
Wondering about her tone of voice.
Well,
So to me, it was like a one-act play, and I saw these two characters on the stage.
very dramatic, yeah.
I felt his desperation, but with her, I could never quite tell if she was being sarcastic or exhausted or exasperated or sad. And I tried out different voices for her.
Yeah.
And the story reads differently depending on how that tone is reflected.
If you can't hear, Charlotte's talking about wondering what Sharon Marilyn's tone of voice is throughout as you read this. And it might be interesting to at least take sections and have two people prepare it and see if they would have the same quality of voice, yeah. Jan?
Well, it seems to me that she has no problem reading a script prepared and acting it out on the phone to a stranger. But when you get acquainted with that person to a degree, she feels she's cheating on her boyfriend.
Well,
Because she's now gone beyond just reading a script and
it's become personal.
a job to make money. She's now involved with this person, and she doesn't feel right about being involved with a stranger on the phone.
Could be, yeah. John?
I remain the skeptic.
Oh, okay.
I think she has the Sharon Act and she's used it before. Maybe sometimes her name is Catherine. Maybe it's just which one she pitches out there in the thousands of calls she
What makes you think that?
Well, I'm just, the whole point is, it's like these internet dating services, all these various, where neither person ever sees the other person.
Yeah.
They never know who's over there. They never know the circumstances. It can all be made up. And it's very easy to swallow and be persuaded by this spiel that Sharon, if that's what we're going to call her name, is giving him. But we don't know. We're taking this for granted. We're assuming perhaps innocent. But she's really saying it. She's really talking about it. This is a real situation. Who knows? She may have other performances she does, sort of styled to what she judges that this character who's called her needs and will respond to.
Yeah.
I mean,
Could be, but the thing is that whatever the human interaction, it's all done electronically. People are not facing each other anymore. Yeah, so we don't know what's real and what isn't. You can take the story, at face value, or you could be right. It's all an act. We don't know because it's a touch phone. Yeah. Anybody else? Things to say?
I was just thinking, Sharon could be Charlotte, we don't know.
Charlene?
Well, he returns to what he starts out as. Man shut off from woman,
Yeah.
and not much is going to happen.
I think I heard you say he's just returned to where he started. Nothing much has happened, yeah.
It's kind of sad and kind of hopeless,
Yeah.
but if he just would do something different, what could he do different? In a story where maybe he have a breakthrough, that's what's fun.
Yeah.
How can you stop the bullshit? And move to a more honest place, a more loving, merciful place, a forgiving place.
Yeah.
Just creative, let's go have some fun. Not the better, but do you have coffee?
Yeah, but I think the sad thing about the story is that this is where someone turns, is to the sex line rather than a legitimate possibility of actually talking to somebody. Bill, I'll let you have the final question or comment.
A 50-year-old single mother trying to support 3 kids.
What?
How migraine, because he keeps saying, well, I want to be intimate. How are you going to be intimate with a phone call anyway?
Yeah, yeah,
He's trying to change the rules of the game, and she doesn't want to change.
yeah. But I would just go back that I think whatever you do, that I love you is important in there. Yeah. But- Margaret?
Yeah, I'll just throw this out there. If any of you are interested in this team, you might check out the movie Her.
HER, that's the digital voice?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you, it's what, a couple, 3 years old, her with Scarlett Johansson, right? Okay, you know, somebody calls Siri kind of thing. Okay. Well, you seem to have enjoyed the story and have some good thoughts about it. So take your break and come back for another good story. 10 minutes, no more.
Very good. Very good. Well,
If she was back there, I'd have her take this off. But I think I saw her take off. Now uh-huh.
whether I'm getting through all right or not. Okay. Again, let me know if you have trouble hearing me. You still may not understand what I say because I'm not sure I understand what I may be saying. But if you have trouble hearing, let me know, please. I've also got a little text for my segment here. It is non-biblical text, but it sort of will overlie some things. We've all heard the phrase or something close to it, art is long and life is short. Or from Longfellow's Psalm of Life, art is long and time is fleeting. I think we're all going to feel that. We're not going to exhaust these stories. This applies both to the person who's creating, who never masters all the art and craft, and who never has time to create all the art one would like to create. And we as consumers of that art run into the same problem. We're never going to read everything. Art is too long. We don't have enough time. And even when we pin down some things, such as these short stories, we still don't have time enough. We can keep, and that may indeed be the mark of art. Not sure. I'm not going to say a great deal today or in the classes ahead about the author. And there are at least 4 reasons for this. There is some information given in the anthology head note, so that you've got some introduction to the writer. Also today, unlike when I started teaching, this information is at your fingertips. If you are interested and want to know more about these writers, what they have written, you can get to that information more efficiently than I can give it to you. Other reason, maybe more important, is I don't know a great deal about them. I have read much less widely and deeply in the lives and the work of these contemporary writers than with at least some of their predecessors. So I don't have the depth of personal knowledge and the basis on which to make recommendations of particular text to you. So I encourage you to find out more on your own. I will say a little something, but not a great deal. Also, again, back to art is long and time is fleeting. We might use our limited class times for maybe some things other than biographical facts, and not deal with things that are easily found online. But let me know if you think I can offer you some help along those lines. Real quick comparison with Dr. Rowe and Nelson, their lives and output. Tanya Nelson has just turned 58 years old. Unlike Dr. O, she's better known for her short fiction than her long fiction. At last count, 4 or 5 novels, 7 or 8 short story collections. She's particularly drawn to the short story. She has been from the beginning. Asked about this one time, she said, "Every time I sit down to write, it's a short story until it isn't." She starts with a short story. That's what she figures she's going to write. That's what she's planning. Sometimes it gets away from her. She's got some interesting transitional novellas that she's appended to 2 of her short story collections. Collection of short stories plus a novella. And this is chronological. She really went through a transition, writing a novella and then getting into the novel there. General characterization of her fiction is I gave you some of that on Dr. O. You can, again, test this and see how typical this story may be of her whole output. She's been called a master of domestic drama. She seems to be particularly concerned, if not obsessed, says one reviewer, with exploring, focusing on being obsessed and fascinated with family situations. That's about her whole work. Like Dr. O, and I thought you might be interested in this, she also has a piece of fiction based on a real crime novel. And I don't know whether you might be interested in following through on this or not. I don't know whether you're looking for ways to satisfyingly, productively spend your free time, or a lawful way to spend it, or unsinful way to spend it, but you could spend the rest of your life reading fiction based on real crime novels, on real crime. And if you want to, just put this in Google. Just speak straightforwardly. Fiction based on, sometimes Google will come up with real crime or true crime. Just put it in there, and you'll be overwhelmed with this. Nelson's novel is called Bound, B-O-U-N-D. It is a novel published in 2010, and it's based on a serial murder active while she was growing up in Wichita, Kansas, called the B.T.K. Murderer. That's a self-description. Her title reflects this, Bind, Torture, and Kill. Series of murders, as I say, in her hometown while she was growing up there. So I often get carried away, and when you go to Google, you're going to find a long list of these. But in the list that I looked at, there weren't many classic writers on there. These are more contemporary and move over into the popular genre more. So I just thought I would mention, in case you do want to devote the rest of your life to reading about crime fiction in fiction. And there's some interesting things there. I mentioned last time Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget. That's a short story. There's a variety of genres, not just short stories and novels. So I just thought I'd mention these to put on your list. You can get started tonight if you want to, or you can forget about it immediately. Robert Penn Warren produced twice, one version in 1953 and another version in 1979, a long poem called Brother to Dragons, a tale in verse and voices. It's poetry. It's also presented as a drama. Some people have called it an epic poem. It's not a traditional epic poem, but it is a long philosophical poem. And it comes out of the December 1811 murder of one of their slaves by Lilburn and Isham Lewis in Virginia. And the Lewises were nephews of Thomas Jefferson. He never mentioned this as far as we know. But the two sons, these two sons of his sister, killed and dismembered one of their slaves. And that's the basis. This is what made Warren start wondering about what Thomas Jefferson would have thought of this horrendous bestial act by blood kin. Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy is well known. Changed the setting, but it's based on a notorious 1906 New York case of a man whose real name was Chester Gillette drowning his lover. Truman Capote is In Cold Blood. You're certainly familiar with 1966. He calls it, of course, a nonfiction novel. Just made a little bit more controversial and very lucrative for him. But the Clutter family's murder in Kansas in 1959 is the basis, obviously, of this nonfiction novel. And close to home, Madison Jones was for a long time the writer-in-residence at Auburn. And Madison produced a short story cycle, a series of short stories, not one short story, but a series of short stories that grew out of the Columbus, Georgia stocking strangler murders. Any of you remember those? Sometimes they were called the Winton Road murders, and there's still controversy over whether the right man was arrested and executed. But starting in 1977, 78, a series of older women, particularly in the Winton Road area of Columbus, were attacked, raped, and murdered. Some of them, not all of those victims died. Some lived. But Madison Jones used this as a context for a series of short stories. It doesn't deal so directly with the murder, so you can find a lot of different varieties of literature and a lot of different ways they are inspired by the crime itself. Okay, finally, slowly making my way to Stitches. I want to trot back out a characterization or description of the short story that I used last time. And this was the description of the short story as giving us a brief immersion in the lives and experiences of others, and maybe, possibly, also offering a vehicle for insight. Both Nelson herself and other commentators have addressed her doing these two things. Nelson herself talked about her own reading as a youth and later and continuously, reading that makes us accustomed to inhabiting other lives and sensibilities. We're immersed in it, at least exposed to it. And one of the readers of her work said, and this is again something you can test personally, that we enter the textured, complicated stories of Nelson as strangers, and then stay on as participants, and at times become co-conspirators. We enter as strangers, stay on, usually as participants in these lives and experiences of others, and at times we become co-conspirators. Again, continue to do some comparison and contrasting, or at least juxtaposing of this story with the other stories we've read so far, which are few in number at this point, of course. Made a claim for Dr. O as a writer of realism. I'd submit to you that we're continuing to be given realistic stories. Dr. O, Bosch, and then Antonia Nelson. I don't think I need much evidence to remind you, since we've all lived through it, that there has been an advance of realism, and I'm going to stay with American literature. When realism was an early reaction to Romanticism, we said, let's tell about life as it really is, but don't go too far. William Dean Howells was a major figure in this movement, but Howells says, you know, it should give us typical life, ordinary life, daily life. Let's don't get out there on those fringes. You know, and the term he used was, let's show the smiling aspects of life. We can still be realistic, but, you know, let's deal with the smiling aspects of life. Well, we've thrown more and more and more open to what writers are allowed to do in all forms of art, I think. So today there's really no subject or topic that's taboo. It's wide open. As I say, you probably don't need much evidence of this. We've lived through it. We can probably all still remember the first time we saw something on the screen that we never expected to see on a screen. My jaw dropped. Or seen things in print that we had only heard or heard about before. And a lot of evidences of this. Some of Faulkner's novels, when they've been put out in their definitive editions, now reproduce some of the profanity that he wanted in that first novel, but that American publishers in the 1930s would not allow him to do. Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, which maybe could have been mentioned as based on crime, but only loosely, the assassination of Huey Long. But All the King's Men is a whole separate book, has been reprinted with the manuscript version that Warren wanted. And believe me, it is not the same as the one we know and love as All the King's Men. It has not supplanted the 1946 text that first appeared, but it's available now. It was never available before. As I say, almost no subjects are taboo anymore, and I will give you some evidence after recognizing that you don't need it. But this recent issue of the Atlantic Monthly has a cover story called The Sex Recession. And they didn't go in for a graphic cover. They've got a bird and a bee. And even inside, the illustrations are two rabbits. But in relation to our story today, the thesis of this article is this should be boom times for sex. But what the article is about, citing a great deal of evidence, survey, and expert interviews and so forth, young people are retreating from society, from intimacy. That's what it's showing. This is an opening here. Sex is portrayed often graphically and sometimes gorgeously on primetime cable. Sexting is, statistically speaking, normal. Shame-laden terms like perversion have given way to cheerful-sounding ones like kink. Anal sex has gone from final taboo to fifth base. And, they note, Teen Vogue, the magazine Vogue for teens, even ran a guide to anal sex. Things have changed. And with the Atlantic, it's particularly interesting. The Atlantic began in 1857 as a stronghold of Boston Puritanism. The Brahmins in Boston established this magazine. James Russell Lowell was the first editor, and it represented that New England Puritan ethic for a number of years. They did publish an article in 1869 by Harriet Beecher Stowe that was intended to warn youth against the bad example of Lord Byron, and got into some fairly salacious details. They lost thousands of subscribers at that point. But if this is the Atlantic today, it contrasts significantly with the Atlantic of the 1850s or 1860s and indeed well into the 20th century. After our first story, I want to propose this. The next two stories, the two stories we're looking at today, either one of them or both, will have us continuing, I think, our consideration, at least of the author's consideration of sex. I would put violence in here as a possibility. Certainly gender. Margaret's mentioned American business enterprise. Dr. Rao talked about Aunt Dora's business. Family, spouse, parent-child, sibling-child relationships in the United States. And perhaps humor. If we have time, I want to talk about that. We seem, I think, to have found at least a little humor in our first two stories, or in the second. I'll ask this real quickly. Anybody find any humor in A House on the Plains besides me? If you didn't go, I'd refer you back to at least that first paragraph, the ending of the first paragraph, where Aunt Dora said, you know, if you don't believe I can convince people that you're my nephew, I've convinced you of a non-existent father. If I can convince you that you don't have a real father, who was my brother, surely I can convince other people. Earl was a little amused at this, and I think we may be as well. But as we roll along, look at the topics we're looking at, and I think we're getting some recurrence here. Gender, sex, American business enterprise, what Nelson called the entanglements of the family. We're all going to be taking a look at. We are going to come to something different here, and unusually so because of these three particular stories, with narrative technique. With Dr. O, we had first-person narration, this person being a fictional actor in the fictional action. But first person, it is Earl's perspective that we get. It is his point of view. And that voice, at least I contended, was a very strong voice, a very memorable voice. And in 1/900, as we've noted, we've got pure dialogue. We've got absolutely pure dramatic form. We don't have first-person narration. We don't have any outside frame narration. We just got the actual dialogue. It's pure dramatic form with the tremendous importance, I would claim, and we noted this too, I think, Margaret, of silence. The three dots there is the way it's rendered in print. But those silences are awfully important, it seems to me. Somebody says something, usually it's John, or whoever he is, and then there's no answer by his partner there. What we have in Stitches is third-person narration, which used to be the most frequent. We're told the story from the outside. We have a storyteller who is talking about he or she. Often used to refer to this as an omniscient narrator who knows everything. This person could tell us everything. She said this and she was thinking this. He replied thinking this. But what we actually have in Stitches is third-person narration, but limited point of view. It is Mother Ellen whose mind we're in. Nelson has talked about this some, and she says that other writers agree with her that this is a fairly difficult thing to do, to have third-person narration, in which, at least theoretically, the storyteller can tell us anything she wants to, but we don't. We don't get into anybody's mind but one person that the author has chosen to do this. So I want to call attention to one quick thing that's been mentioned before. At least I made the claims the first time about the connections brought in from other works. Out of all the names, practically an infinite number of possibilities that Nelson could have used for the professor become TA, become seducer, become abuser, however we want to finally decide on that. She chose the name Henry Fielding on page 397. And Ellen is surprised that Tracy doesn't put that together. And then she realizes that maybe I hadn't heard of Henry Fielding until later. If you don't recall, and we're more likely to because of the film, Tom Jones. But again, that's at your fingertips at Google. But this is not an accidental, fortuitous choice. She has chosen the name of the 18th century British novelist who began to open up a lot of subjects. Tom Jones is a lusty youth, to say the least, a foundling. And so one of the films made from this is Lock Your Daughters Up. There were some films that came along after Tom Jones. The Bawdy Adventures of Tom Jones was one of them. Lock Your Daughters Up. So this was chosen to add a little depth and a little reflection on this. There have been Tom Jones. I guess Tom Jones was too obvious, but Henry Fielding has been around for several centuries in literature, telling these sort of stories, but not in this way. Not in this way. The technique has changed. Once again, I want to call attention to the opening lines. This is, again, classic, I think, on page 592. Mama, she said, the word cut through every layer. The dark house, the late hour, the deep sleep, the gin still polluting her blood, the dream still spinning whimsically. All of it sliced away as with a scalpel by her daughter's voice on the phone. Okay, we're strangers and we're probably going to be participants at this point. We're going to go along here. We want to see what this early AM phone call is all about, from our own experience or just from general curiosity. We want to see what's going on here. Nelson was fond of talking about what she called the shape of a story rather than plot. And so I want to just throw that term and that concept out. We don't have time to talk much about it, but the shape of this story. If you can move over to some sort of graphic representation. We're going to stay in Ellen's mind, but that mind goes different places. And she herself, in the course of the dramatic action, gives us one account of this with having Ellen remember the way Tracy usually proceeds. She's a drama queen, according to her brother. She emphasizes some things. She knows what she's doing, but she also backpedals. This is the way she standardly operates. She starts out at an extremity, and then she's going to work her way back. And that's the way things get revealed in this story. Is it rape? Well, not really. Is it that full title professor? Well, actually, it's a TA. And then what happens that night, she's going to walk it back, walk back and forth. So we've got a lot of movement in this. One of the things that I wish we had time to talk more about would be the last part of this characterization of the short story, which says that not only do we get immersed in the lives and experiences of others, as I think this story is likely to do, but we may, in this action, find a vehicle for insight. That would be my question, had we whirled enough in time, what insight is provided? Of course, we need to talk about insight. I'm not going to dwell on this, and some of you have heard this story before. When I was in graduate school, one of my housemates was a physics major. And we got to bantering back and forth between those of us who were pursuing studies in the liberal arts and those of us who were pursuing studies in science. And he says, I don't know what the hell you people do with your time. He says, you know, it's simple. Somebody had told him about the philosopher Duns Scotus, and he said, if you know Duns Scotus, you know all philosophical knowledge. I know that. I went to Cal Berkeley. I learned that. He said, I also took a literature course, and what I learned was, if you find out the author's message, you've got it. He said author's message. He said, just, you know, sort of like taking that string off of a dog food sack or tearing that thing. Once you get in there and get it and eat it, that's it. You just crack the nut and go on to the next one. He said, I don't know what you people spend all your time talking about all this for. Once you've got the author's message, you got it. The author always is trying to tell you something. And once you can figure that out, you got it. He says it's usually somewhere in a line in the story. I quit going to movies with him because he would yell out in a crowded movie theater, author's message. We didn't get thrown out, but I quit sitting with him. I would not sit with him anymore. So, you know, is there, what is the insight we may get from this, from this story is my question. The American short story almost became defined by the epiphany. At one point, Margaret can correct me, which she may need to at any time. But thanks partly to James Joyce and his short fiction, it was believed that all stories should give the character and therefore us an epiphany, a new insight, a new realization, some illumination about what had happened. We've moved away from that. We don't have this so much formula anymore, but the questions still exist. And I want to raise the question here for a particular reason. Stitches ends on page 606. And it may appear to be, my friend's name was Joe Peluso. This is where Joe would have stood up and said, there it is right here, Arthur's message. The world is not fair. You got it. And he would have regretted that we had to read all the way through the story together. Of course, what we thought he did was to sit and read the dials on something that looked like a giant window fan all day with physics. That's all he did, was do that all day. But is this all there is to it? No, it's not fair. Ellen is seconding Tracy here. This was what college would teach Tracy. It was, after all, the only lesson, and some people never learned it. Is that the insight we get from this story? Has Nelson wrapped this up in a neat little package for us now after she's carried us through very, very dramatic action? Well, I'm raising more questions than I'm answering, of course. But this particular question is complicated with this particular story because what appears in our anthology is not the ending of earlier versions. original version appeared in the New Yorker in 1999. It was collected in a 2002 collection of Nelson's short stories called Female Trouble. And that is the publication that the Permissions cites here. We have reprinted this. It is to be assumed from this short story collection. But there are about a dozen more paragraphs. I'll read it real quickly. I should have had the good sense to put it up here. After the ending you've got here. Tracy says, "I'm sorry, Mama. You don't have to be sorry, darling. You just have to convince your father that you're okay." "I know. I figured that out. You think I'm okay?" "I think you are." She did, actually. Ellen listened sleepily to the lack of static. Did she need to say that this was only the beginning of Tracy's difficult education, that no love would be pure, no gesture uncomplicated for a long, long time? Over the phone, there was silence, as if they would now slip into sleep, into the same dream. "I'm a good actor," Tracy said finally, as if trying to rally. "I can make my eyes water in a New York minute." "Useful," Ellen said. Then she heard her husband's knock on Tracy's dorm door and was startled lucid once more. From 100 miles, she recognized the confident force of his fist. There was no mistaking it. "Shh, there's someone at the door," Tracy said, fear in her voice. "It's your father." He made record time. Ellen sat up and checked her bedside clock, an hour and a half. The cat had stopped purring, eyes perked, whiskers lifted. "Let him in," she told Tracy as the cat jumped briskly to the floor. "He'll know," Tracy wailed. "I've never been able to fool him." "He won't," her mother assured her. "You have." When Tracy dropped the receiver, Ellen had the sensation of being let go, left behind. Now she was just a plastic instrument lying on the dorm table while a lock was turned and a door was opened. "He won't," Ellen heard, and would hear for a long time reverberating, "You have." Far away, her daughter said her next word. "Daddy," she said, and Ellen hung up. I'm sorry I didn't reproduce it, and I can reproduce it if you'd like to compare and think about this a little bit more, but somewhere along the way, somebody, and I don't know whether it was Antonia Nelson or not, we may want to ask her, preferred the ending that's in our anthology, unless a printer made a mistake, and that's not impossible there. Does this alter the story? It's more dramatic in a way. It brings a conclusion to the story that's part of the dramatic action. But it shifts this emphasis to Tracy and her father, which is not the emphasis we've had before. We've had it covered some, but it's not been the emphasis. John?
Well, the thing about it is that answers the question I was left with at the end, and maybe others were. Somehow it quit too quickly. Here was the father out there somewhere. We wanted to know. There was something that needed to be tied up, and it wasn't. Well, they're finding, well, the author chopped it off right there. Well, now we know she did not chop it off.
Well, maybe she did. I'll try to find that out and let you know. Maybe she did chop it off. The fact is, it is chopped off. It is chopped off. We've got two printed versions that end the way you've heard it. Again, it gets us into narrative techniques. I think we maybe do wonder, but we can construct. We know the father's on his way, but we don't have the story carrying attention to that. Yeah.
It's the same in the theater, though, as you go on the table in Act 1, somebody better get shot by Act 3.
Right.
The father needs to show up.
Okay. You agree? What's that, Pam?
What did you say?
He said the father needs to show up. The father, why? Okay. He's on his way. The short story cannot go on forever.
She makes a point of his being there at the beginning.
He's on his way, and we assume he can be there. Well, what happens when the father talks to her? Where do we stop this? What happens when the father and she talks? She's going to fool the father. Gonna try to. Time's up, right? It's yours. It's yours. Hey, would time it'd be fun to talk a little bit about the title? Yeah. Yeah, and this might be another point after the fact that Joe would stand up and say, Arthur's message. Stitches is mentioned. Yes, it is in the text. And how can what's happened be changed or repaired? How can you alleviate your daughter's pain? And she thinks of a physical way to do it, which may be needed. We don't know. Art is long and life is short. Dwight?
Seems to be the ending we have in our textbook is
Go ahead.
is very disappointing. It's a flat, cliche ending, and it's unresolved, as is the other ending. It's also unresolved. Dad shows up, but that's what's going to happen.
Right.
It seems to me that the beauty of the story lies in the experience of the mother and our perception of her relationship, especially with Tracy.
Yeah.
Tracy is a wonderful creation, I think. I mean, we don't hear Tracy as a narrator, but she's just lovable, wonderful.
Yeah. And I think we'll get that from the mother remembering. Our time is up. I'm going to give you a statement from Nelson. Fiction is not like therapy. It does not yield solutions, closures, answers. Though both pull from the same source, one's history, one's mysterious relationship with that history, one's dreamlike associative logic when putting together the elements of that history. But fiction ought to announce, dramatize, display the problem, but it will offer no set answer. It will make sure the mystery is retained. Okay, that's what she said. Okay. The last time, and then they're going to force us out. Yes, it is on page 602. Yeah, page 602, about the long paragraph in the middle. Yeah, 602. It is in the text there. Okay. Thanks once again.